Okay, welcome everyone to, it's Thursday, July 1st at 5:32. This is a special meeting of the Norwich Select Board. I am in Tracy Hall and board members are joining us remotely. Oh gosh, I can see myself in two different places. This is really disorienting because this is a true sort of hybrid meeting. Okay, so, sorry. Okay. The CATV is reminding me that I can hide myself if I'd like to. Okay, so as I was saying, this is a special meeting. Herb Durfee and I are in Tracy Hall, and we are joined by Mary Layton, Claudette Verschow, Rob Gear remotely, and I'm sure Marsha Calloway will join us shortly, is what I was hearing as we started our meeting. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda.
I move that we approve the agenda as presented.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, made by Mary, seconded by Rob. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next item on our agenda is, sorry, let me pull up the agenda. Public and select board comment. Would any members of the public like to make a comment for items not on the agenda? Go ahead, Stuart Richards.
Stuart Richards, 82 Elm Street. The reason I tuned into this meeting is I want to talk about both what the select board is doing with regard to police and also with regard to the sewer study. I really do object to your cutting the hours of the police and not providing adequate protection for the people of Norwich. And I'm not sure what the rationale is, but the cuts are pretty clear. You received a letter from at least one Norwich citizen who had talked to our prior chief, Doug Robinson, and outlined the actual hours that were being cut. I think it's very ill-advised. You received another letter from Deborah Hannum, whose house was broken into, two masked people with an axe, and it was quite fortunate that no one was hurt. I myself have had my garage broken into twice, and I think that it's very ill-advised for you to continue to cut the police hours. And I would like to see you rectify that. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is the sewer study. I'm not sure why you are doing another sewer study. There was one that was very comprehensive that was done back in 2005. And I'd like to just put in the record what was said on the executive summary of that. It's very short. It begins, determine whether or not there is, this is in the executive summary. It begins, determine whether or not there's a problem with the current system and make recommendation of changes. Vermont officials who have been consulted, including engineers, administrators, and regulators, have told this committee, this is the sewer committee of 2005, that we do not have a problem with the current system. And it goes on to talk about commonly held misperceptions. I don't understand why this select board wants to spend 30 grand or 15 grand or whatever the amount is when there's not a need to actually do that. The only justification can be to change the town so that we have increased development. And I personally do not favor increased development. I don't see that there's a need. We've had several surveys, the most recent one in 2018, which hopefully you have read, in addition to the sewer survey that I referred to. And that survey showed that people liked the size of Norwich the way it was. So I don't know why you're pursuing this, to me, you've got a situation where you've got a, you're looking for a solution in search of a problem. I mean, where's the problem? The problem doesn't exist environmentally. And if you do want to do development, I just think that you're totally out of line. So thanks for hearing me out. I've gotten my 2 minutes.
Yes,
And
3
then
minutes.
some.
Yes.
2 minutes and 20 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever it was, Roger.
Yes, 58 seconds. Thank you, Stuart, for your public comment.
Thank you for listening. And I hope you
Yes.
take some action with regard to what I'm saying.
Okay. So any other public comments? I see we're being joined. Marcia's now joining us, so that's great. Okay. Hi, Marcia, no worries. Okay. Seeing no other public comments, are there any select board comments before we move on to our agenda? Okay. Seeing none. Sorry, I'm pulling up my agenda to see which policy is up first. Okay, so we wanted, the next item is the agenda item is the highway fund, the chart of accounts, and the fund balance reserve policy. The action is that we will discuss the efficacy of a highway fund and provide direction accordingly for the fund balance reserve policy as it is applicable. So I think this is in some ways a carryover of a previous discussion. And so can I actually, would it be okay, Marcia, I know that you just joined us, to sort of summarize where you and Claudette think we're trying to take us with this policy at a high level?
If I could get Claudette to start so I can
Sure.
find it. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things I think both Marcia and I agreed on is that we wanted to get the reserve fund out of the general fund and have it as a separate fund, a separate account even, so that it could not, so that it was not commingled with the general fund.
You mean the highway fund? One of the
No.
highway.
No, I'm
You said
talking,
you said the reserve fund. Is
Right.
that what you meant?
so I'm talking first the reserve fund, which
one?
currently, pardon me?
Which one? I don't understand.
The undesignated, what's
Ah,
classified
yeah.
now as the
Okay.
undesignated fund.
thank you. Yes, thank you.
To take that out of the general fund and call it the reserve fund.
Okay.
Cash reserve fund. That's a great idea.
And then
Personal.
the second piece to Marcia's comments months ago that if we also broke out a highway fund, monies not spent could be rolled over into the next year. Whereas now, because the highway fund is again commingled in the general fund, monies not spent specifically in the DPW line items are either,
Just not getting it right. Yeah.
they're just either rolled into, they're not separate. So that's,
So, and I think, so this, and if I may, so this conversation is referring to sort of the organization of sort of the chart of accounts, essentially. And so let's actually, Herb, can you tell us a little bit how this is actually, the chart of accounts is organized now, and sort of how that, and speak to sort of what Claudette and Marcia are talking about a little bit. And can you address this idea of commingled funds? Go ahead, Marcia. I can't see your hand.
Hi. Sorry, Herb. I just wanted to say that the genesis of this was that I was reading the statutes to see what was allowed for town accounts. And while there may be some wiggle room in so far as nobody's around with a hand to slap and say, this shouldn't be done this way or whatever. As Claudette pointed out, there's some things that go into the highway fund that really have to be kept separate. And so it seemed to me seeing the reports that we get and seeing the statutes, it would be so much easier for us to understand where the money's going if we just followed the statutory construction.
Okay, so that's actually helpful. So because it gives more of something for Herb to respond to. And sorry, Herb, no pressure, but can you help us sort of understand this from your experience and your understanding a little bit?
Sure. Just in general, right now, without having a transportation fund, you have both anything what would be related to transportation funds. Think of the Department of Public Works budget, the highway operations, in the same fund, the general fund as it's termed, with the regular other line items in the town budget. If you, and what happens at the end of a general fiscal year is that if there are funds generally left over, that's the fund balance, and that's the undesignated fund balance. So presently, the undesignated fund balance is your fund balance at a particular year. I actually just emailed again the balance sheet so everybody could see that what that number is. Presently, we're like at about $610,000, but that's through period 11. So that it looks like our fund balance is going to be somewhat less than that with another period in there, but it's in a commingled situation like Claudette described. If you create and in order to use undesignated funds, you have to ask the voters to use those funds. Otherwise, they just stay in the undesignated fund balance. The premise of having a highway fund is that you have two separate funds, the general fund, which are your sort of your general operations, town administration type stuff, and then your highway funds, which essentially would become the Department of Public Works highway operations, not including the buildings and grounds or the transfer station. Those funds would be put in a separate fund. You would still have the same chart of accounts. And that's critical to understand. But in terms of the accounting for it, you would have two different funds. It might the chart of accounts might change where you have to have a -5 instead of a -1. So there would be a subtle change to it there. But in essence, you can keep the same numbers for the most part. What happens in that instance at the end of a year, if you have a surplus or a transportation fund positive balance, the select board itself can decide what to do with those funds in an ensuing year. You do not require additional voter approval for anything as long as it's spent on transportation related projects or things eligible under that transportation fund. The general fund still remains subject to the voter approval.
I see.
And then the sidebar to this, so to speak, that's a critical piece is that Claudette and Marcia have recommended that we have it's essentially a separate reserve fund or another designated fund, as this town is used to calling them, that would be the emergency reserve fund. We would ask the voters to first establish that fund. Secondly, we would ask the voters to transfer a portion of the undesignated fund into that to create the base level. And then every year thereafter, you would look at your fund balance after your audit and see if there are additional surplus funds that could be asked of the voters to shift into that reserve to maintain your policy, or if not, raise it through the regular budget process to ensure again that your policy of having an emergency reserve of say 60 days worth of reserve is there and available for those emergency disaster situations.
So Claudette and Marcia, does Herb's summary, which I found helpful, reflect your understanding of the situation? No. So go ahead, Marcia. Why not?
Because if I do a search in the statutes for the word undesignated, under municipalities, it doesn't come up. There's no statutory construction for an undesignated fund. And so when you look at the other statutory provisions for different funds, it's very clear what happens to those monies at the end of a year. They either carry forward, as Herb described, or they don't carry forward. They have to go back to the voters. And what the statutes suggest, am I frozen?
No, keep going.
Okay. What the statutes suggest are that you have a reserve fund And you can call your, you can have multiple reserve funds or put them all under one penumbra, sort of, so that you've got a reserve fund for X, a reserve fund for disaster, whatever. But you could have a reserved fund for, those unexpected expenses, which I think is what we have tried to incorporate here under the policy in the fund balance reserve. So that, in fact, you say to the voters, we're always going to maintain this much money so that if something happens that we didn't anticipate, maybe not rising to the level of a true disaster, but we didn't anticipate it. Are you all there?
We're all here. Maybe my face is thinking, and maybe that you think I'm frozen. Maybe that's what it is.
No, I'm
go ahead.
frozen. On my screen shows I'm frozen most
Okay.
unattractively.
Okay.
But so that's why I'm concerned. I think it would be so much cleaner if we just said, this is what we want to put in these reserve funds. And then you go ahead.
No, I want to, I think actually before I see Mary has her hand up, I actually think that you and her might be saying the same thing. I think but the nomenclature, which is important, is being differently. So I think when we say the undesignated fund, that is the fund balance reserve fund.
The fund balance.
The fund balance.
The fund balance is termed in Norwich the undesignated fund balance. And that the undesignated fund balance is where that the current policy comes from. It's from the past, but that is the fund balance. And currently that fund balance, or known as the undesignated fund balance, serves as the reserve fund, the emergency reserve fund. Marcia and I are totally agreeing that we need a separate fund that is not the fund balance or the undesignated fund balance, to use the same term as that. We want a separate fund apart from everything else that has the amount of money that we need for the day that everything blows up. If the other side of something that I heard from Marcia is that if you want even a separate fund from that, just to deal with a situation where you are thinking that you got a deficit coming or something and you want to dip into some operational funds, that can be separately. But the emergency reserve is actually that sort of like it can be 30-day, 45-day, 60-day, whatever. That is what you keep in reserve. That's a portion of your current operational budget for that act of God situation.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're saying the same thing, Marcia.
But the nomenclature, I am curious about the nomenclature. If we could make it sort of consistent with statute, that might be helpful. Okay, Mary, did you have your hand up?
Yes, so I totally agree with the logic and the necessity to establish a cash reserve fund. And I think it'd be sensible to, set a 3-month level, 3 months of our operating budget as what should go into it. Relating to this idea, when Marcia and I were working on the debt management policy, we were talking about short-term debt and added a section that's about climate related disasters, such as a 2017 storm that caused a huge short-term cash disaster, just a need for short-term cash. We were trying to find a way to define what happened, define what to do in the future. So I almost think that in addition to the 3 months cash reserve, there might be proposed also some sort of storm fund or disaster fund that also could be, the voters could decide whether they want to set aside money for that as well.
Great, so I'll kick it back to her. There's no reason, could you have multiple, you could have multiple reserve funds?
Yes, you can, as long as you get obtain the voter approval to do that. I would suggest at some point, that's where you kind of want to look at short-term borrowing to anticipate that, rather than having so many funds out there that are sort of for emergency purposes. You're raising funds and holding on to funds that you probably won't spend in a while, and that's such as the July 1 storm, where we went out and did some temporary borrowing to handle the fixes that we had to do without taking away from our operational budget, so we could continue doing whatever we normally had to do. But I do understand that you may want to have your regular emergency reserve for the act of God, and then maybe have some kind of an emergency storm reserve that gives, that's sitting there, that allows you to authorize me, once, if you approve it, gives me some money to go and do something, to do a quick fix on something, as a for instance.
So, okay, so it sounds, go ahead, Mary.
And I think, it might make sense just to revisit that if we get around to the debt policy, that idea, because we'll have
We
to.
will.
I know, well, if we do. But the other thing is that there really is an A and B to this discussion, because the other part is about whether to have a highway fund, and also what carries forward. So I just wanted to say, I think one of Marcia's references was the Vermont Municipal Treasurer's VLCT duties and responsibilities, which unfortunately was, it's 2002, it's being updated, but it did say specifically with section 312, funds raised from highway taxes shall not be used for any other purpose. Highway funds left over at the end of the year must be carried forward and used for their original purpose next year. They cannot be used to make up a deficit in the general fund. So that just raised a question with what Herb said about the select board having the authority to decide what would happen with highway funds that had to be carried forward. So that's a question.
So let's separate some of the thinking out. So I think I want to sort of ask us, do we believe in the revision of, sort of taking the undesignated fund, or the fund balance reserve, the process of, the process at the end after the audit, asking sort of the voters to move things into an emergency reserve fund? It seems like I'm hearing from the people that we support that as a board. Is that what I'm
raise
hearing?
our hands? Shall we raise our hands or something?
Sure, I'm looking, we should, I'm seeing, okay, we're all, we're all just.
What do you think, Rob?
Rob,
good, yeah.
Okay,
Good.
and Herb has put that kernel before us for a couple of years now, so we should be,
Time to pop that kernel.
yes, let's make some popcorn. Okay, that's great. Now should we talk about the highway fund bit then? Go ahead, Marcia, do you want to? I'm trying to be efficient. I don't have to be. No, go.
Just before we leave that, I'd like to sort of see the word undesignated wiped from our slate.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Cash reserve fund, I think, is the way to go. Or
Herb,
something like 3-month cash. That would be part of defining it for the next reading, I think, wouldn't it? But yes, if we're talking people's opinions, definitely. Let's get rid of that.
Yeah, when you go forward with a fund balance policy as it may be currently written, you're not using the term undesignated fund anymore, so you're fine with fund balance on that. But just recognize there probably will be some people that are former select board members or what have you that will continue to refer to it as undesignated, but I don't disagree with you, Marcia.
Thank you. So I just sort of see the cash reserves as maybe like we get some sort of an attack on our system, our computer system, and we can't function for a little bit, right? Versus the 2017 storm, which maybe would come from that disaster fund, that sort of thing. Anyway, move on.
Yeah, go ahead, Claudette. What did you say?
Before we move on, I want to remove the emergency from that fund name. It's the fund balance reserve.
Okay.
Because that kind of goes to Mary's point in their debt management policy.
Good.
But I think so. Well, I guess we should talk about that a little bit more, because I think the naming, right, sort of declares an intention to the voters too, right? So if you say, if you make the request to voters to move things to an emergency fund, I agree that there is, potential interpretations about what an emergency might mean, but I do think, you know, that could be potentially helpful for a voter, right? No?
But to Herb's point, you know, yeah, I don't, it's the, how many emergency funds are we going to establish here? So
This is the one that the GFOA recommend, and every other auditor will recommend that you have. You need a reserve fund. I don't care what rose you want to call it by any other name, but you need to have that. You need to establish, as you sort of already done in your existing policy, whether it's a 30, 45 day, 60 day, that's where that 12 to 16% number comes in every single year. And that's your reserve for emergencies. It's
But
not for anything else.
I think Claudette is referring to a designated fund, which is also a reserve fund. Go ahead, Claudette.
the title of the policy is the fund balance reserve.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's what I would like to see it called, the fund balance reserve.
Yes, but I think the fund balance. So I think
It describes in the policy what it should be used for.
But it's not to protect, the fund balance. It's to ensure your operations of your town in an emergency.
Can
I don't
I
we,
mean, like, again, you call it anything you want from my perspective, and I agree with you that, you know, if you got it described, fine. But
Like Roger said, we're talking the same thing. We're just kind of, we're agreeing on the same thing. It's just what name it's going to be called.
Well, I move that we call this proposed new designated fund, the Fund Balance Reserve Fund. I made a motion.
can you title it again?
Yes, the Fund Balance Reserve, the Fund Balance Reserve.
Well, I'll second it, but I have a comment.
Sure.
Is everybody keeps freezing on my screen, so are you all there?
Yeah.
yes, we promise.
Okay. So when I look at this, in the statutes, it's reserve funds. And I think what they're saying is those reserve funds are designated funds because they have to be voted at town meeting and they're used for a specific purpose. And it can be anything. So I sort of see this as a reserve fund basket. And in that reserve fund basket, we have the fund balance reserve, right? And we may have the disaster fund reserve, and we may have another one that we come up with. Does that make sense?
It's true, but we might want to debate whether we want to add the disaster one because, you know, Herb was saying, well, maybe it should be more line of credit or something like that, some other way of financing for that. But this way, we have a designated fund that the voters decide every year, just as they do when we donate for fire apparatus or any of our other designated funds. They decide that, yes, it's prudent for the town to reserve 3 months of operating costs in that fund in case there is a data breach, a weather, you know, whatever would disrupt things. You know, it's just like, I think that even for personal finance, they say having 3 months of your expenses is a prudent thing to do. And
Right.
so this would make it, though, that the voters make that decision and that it's defined what we're talking about. So I think it's a really prudent move. And, you know, I think we should decide at least what to call it. I have a feeling we're all on board with this anyway. I don't think this is formally putting it, you know, into a motion that would say, let's establish it so the voters can vote on it, but at least we could name it. So my motion was about naming it.
Okay, I'll call the question. All in favor of,
Before you call the question, what was the
Yeah.
motion again, Mary?
Oh, it was to, I didn't write it.
I was going to repeat it when I.
Yeah, would you please? Thanks.
So it was, I think it was all in favor of referring to this fund as the fund balance reserve fund.
Just fund balance.
Fund
reserve. She
balance
took out
reserve.
fund, yeah.
So that was the motion. It was all in favor of calling it the fund balance reserve. All in favor? Oh, are we ready to vote now, Claudette?
Yep.
Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, roll call. Mary, how do you vote?
I vote yes.
Okay, Marcia, how do you vote?
Yes,
Claudette, how do you vote?
Yes.
Rob, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I abstain. Okay. So we're good. We know what to call it. We know what to call it, right? We agree that we agree on a process right after the audit now, which is new for this town. And now let's talk about the highway fund. Is that okay? Or is that not necessarily part of the policy?
I think when we come back to revisit this policy, I think it would be good to have language for actually establishing this fund as a designated fund, because we didn't do that.
Reserve fund? Yeah.
Well, yeah, as the fund balance reserve, just to establish it as a designated fund, because we didn't do that by renaming it. And I don't know if we should do it tonight, because this is sort of a first reading kind of night. But I think at least for the next meeting, there should be some language about that. You know, about that it should be put on the ballot for March.
Okay. So my next question, do we want to have a discussion of the highway fund, or does the first reading, does this policy at this time require that discussion?
I would like a general sense on where the board feels about establishing a separate highway fund.
Okay, thank you, Claudette. How does the board feel about that? Go ahead, Rob.
So some of the language that was quoted referred to a highway tax. Does that mean we need to break out the highway expenditures as a part of the DPW's expenditures as a separate line item that we generate tax funds for, specifically calling it a highway tax?
Yes, thank you, Rob. Herb is saying yes, and should I turn to Herb now and ask him also a little bit about the auditing process and how it would look different? How about that? Herb, do you have?
So
any-
just quickly on your revenue side of your budgeting process, you would separate out the highway fund from the general fund figures. Ultimately, you would raise monies to cover the highway fund, property tax monies to deal with the highway fund, and property tax revenues to offset the general fund. Ultimately, when you do your tax worksheet, like you're going to this coming Tuesday, you'll see a breakout of the municipal rate for the general fund and the municipal rate for the highway fund, like you would local agreement and county tax. But it would still be all at the end of the day, you're still going to adopt a total homestead rate and a total non-residential rate.
Okay, go ahead, Claudette.
And Herb also, I believe, is part of that, because we get the gas tax money that is supposed to be used exclusively for highway or for roads and whatever. There would
That
be
would show, oops,
some
sorry.
accounting to allow, or some way to account for that money, right?
Yep. So yes, sorry for the accounting auditing side of it. You would show, again, when you develop your budget, you would show offsetting revenues for the highway fund, and then the remaining, which would include the highway tax type stuff. And then the remaining balance would be the amount of money that you need to raise through taxes to create that. And you show that through the monthly financial reports in terms of just like you get now. And then also with the auditing process, you would see in your audit a separation of the two, again, with the revenues going applicably to each fund. Yep.
Okay, Marcia.
might it not be the easiest if we just had another policy that says the town of Norwich maintains these funds, and then just identify them, the general fund? pursuant to this statute, the highway fund pursuant to that statute, the reserve funds reference back to the section 10 fund balance. And then we don't have to reinvent wheels. We just sort of say, these are the funds that we have.
It will definitely, that's a question that I'll have with the auditor. In essence, typically what you do is like with our regular general fund, everything is like 01-1- something. And that shows that it's the general fund. In any town that I've worked with that have a transportation fund, they'll have something like 01-2, which would be the transportation fund. So we may have to alter our chart of accounts just slightly for one of those first 2 or 3 numbers to show the difference between general fund and transportation fund. If the auditor says that we can keep the same numbers and just do a breakout in the NEMRIC system, our accounting software, and obviously she can do the breakout in the audit, that's fine with me. My guess is that we're going to have to just change a 1 to a 5 for the highway operation funds. Something not doesn't have to be a 5, but something like that. Yeah, without overall changing the accounts.
So I see that there are public comments, but I want to finish up this discussion. Go ahead, Marcia.
And wouldn't we then also have, like, I don't know, I'm making this up, 01-3 for the reserve funds, 01-4 for the trustee funds?
We all have that already. Yep. So for any
Okay.
designated fund, any reserve fund, any special purpose fund, whatever you want to call it, fund, we've got a separate number for that. And we're even going further than that, where we're trying to do a better job of when we get a specific grant, is to have specific numbers where we have the, you know, the one hand over here and one hand over here. So the scale is always evening out. It won't be separate fund, but it'll be similarly like that in the accounting structure. But yep.
So I appreciate sort of Marcia's sort of note on a possible process. And what I would say is that process would be enriched when we have a finance director. And so I am not keen on I'm not keen on really having much more elaborate conversations on the highway fund until we have that hire. Like, it's, you know, just plain and simple.
A couple of hands up.
Yeah, so that's how I feel. And then I'm going to take public comment unless any board members have anything further. Go ahead, Marcia.
I would kind of like to have the highway fund, and I don't know why it needs a finance director right now. I think it exists, and we just need to make sure that we don't have anything mingled and we're doing it all properly. But
I'll chat with Cynthia and our auditor when I can get her, because she's in the middle of doing a bunch of audits, just to ask the particular question on that. But I do think that at some point, I do think that there may be some necessary re-examination of our chart of accounts to look at. And to me, that's when a finance director comes on board. So for the sake of just trying to minimize reviews, that I kind of would like to wait till the finance director gets here, but certainly I can at least explore if we have to change numbers or not.
We're over time. We're about 10 minutes over time. So I'll take board member.
Roger, pull the mic closer to you.
We're about 10 minutes over time. So I'm going to take any other discussions on. I haven't really heard from Rob and Claudette and Mary about the highway fund. Marcia and I were both very clear, I think. Go ahead, Mary.
I'm willing to talk about it more in the future, but I don't want to deal with it tonight. I do understand that it's great to define things from where they come in statute. So I do think, I see where Marcia's coming from on that. And I don't want it to get lost, but I would rather not deal with it tonight. I'd like to have some more information.
Yeah, maybe perhaps part of a chart of account process with our
Right.
hire. Go ahead, Claudette and Rob, if you would like.
I'll let Rob go first.
I think that given the advantages of being able to keep the unexpended funds to carry over to the next year as a bonus, I think in practice, we probably have not been adding those. Number one, I think we've probably been expending all of those funds. And number two, therefore not having to worry about separating them out with the undesignated concept there. So I think it's a good idea.
Herb wants to.
Yeah, just the approval process, you know, you do, if you have a transportation fund, just the only difference there with regard to carryovers is that for the transportation fund, the board alone can decide what to do with the carryover as long as it's spent on the things that are intended in the transportation fund. Anything else has to go before the voters. That's the benefit of the transportation fund specific to carry forwards.
Should I take public comment, Claudette?
You know,
Or-
I'm torn.
Yeah.
I would like to see us revisit this. Maybe not, it's actually, this is not final anyway. This would only be a first read, but I'm torn. I do want to, yes, I want to see a highway fund, sorry, a transportation fund.
Yeah, I don't think Mary and I were necessarily
Right, but
saying
it's,
that either.
yeah. So whether or not we prepare to go before the voters in March to request, I guess we need to come to some kind of resolution prior to the budget year about
Ding,
this
ding,
highway
ding.
fund.
Ding, 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 yeah.
So,
Okay, well, I think it is, my read of this is that it's tabled for now, or is that an incorrect read? It's tabled for now.
If it's tabled, doesn't it have to be to a date certain?
No, Herb tells me no.
No? Okay.
No, there's two different
but-
kinds of tabling. You can table to a time certain, or you can table it, which means it stays tabled indefinitely until there's a motion to take it off the table.
Okay.
We can table it into budget season if people are more comfortable with that. Okay. I'm going to say that the board by consensus agreed to table the discussion of the highway fund until their budget season. Is that what okay?
we do have two people waiting to.
I'm getting there.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, I see them. Herb reminded me too. Linda Cook, you've been waiting longest.
Hi there, Linda Cook, 147 River Road. Thank you, Claudette, for bringing up the gas tax. That is a part that is a rollover fund. Herb, how much is generally collected on that gas tax?
Right off the top of my head, I want to say it's like 150,000.
And are there any other dollars you can think of that would also roll into that fund?
We don't charge fees for something. That's generally the largest sum that you get from the state that you would affiliate to the highway section of your budget alone.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, and also my understanding is with the emergency reserve fund that you all were talking about, one of the main things Herb can explain is when there's a storm like the 2017, there's X amount of time you have to spend dollars. And I don't know, Herb, if you're looking at a limit with those dollars or just building it up for that reserve.
If I understood you correctly, if we create the fund balance reserve and the voters agree to, my guess is that there will be some sufficient amount of money from the current fund balance at year's end to ask voters to shift at least a portion of that over in there that will give you the, I'm just using the term right now, the 60-day reserve that the Government Finance Officers Association recommends, as does our auditor. And that's an amount of money that you keep monitoring on an annual basis to keep it at you have to look at your operational budget each year. So you want to keep it at that 60-day amount. And so it will rise. It needs to rise with any budget rise. And that stays in there indefinitely until you have to use it. We all hope that we never have to use it, but it's there as that reserve. When you ultimately use it, then the town has to go back and replenish it at some point after the reserve, so you get back to whatever your policy is. If we have other purposes in that fund balance reserve besides just the emergencies, such as that Marcia had mentioned earlier tonight, the same would apply, just the complexity of the different purposes for what it would be used for, balanced with the policy, but always keeping in mind that you need to maintain that 60 days worth, net worth for that big act of God situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Pam Smith. You're next. Pam Smith.
Sorry, had technical difficulties. Pam Smith, 1445 New Boston Road. I'm just trying to understand when you use the term fund, a reserve fund, a highway fund, a general fund, are you talking separate checking accounts for each of these funds?
No.
No, there's a general ledger that is the overall umbrella for everything that we have. Underneath that umbrella are different funds.
So it's just how you
Everything-
manage the chart of accounts.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, all right. And then one other question I had was, we did vote for a $45,000 climate emergency fund, I believe
Yeah.
was the amount. Do we
40.
have a policy for that yet?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And that was originally part of this agenda, which got packed, but I do, the legislative intent has been discussed, but the process, but it has not been formally written, I would say. But yes,
So you're working on a policy, you haven't developed one yet?
the board has not yet taken action on a rationale or legislative intent for that fund outside of our previous discussions. Does that make sense?
Okay. No, but thank you.
Well, feel free to let me know how I could provide some clarity. Okay, let's move on. So is there a motion for the first reading of this?
Let's see. I moved, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
I think it was. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I move to accept as a first reading the proposed highway fund chart of accounts and fund balance reserve policy as presented tonight.
Want to make a friendly amendment, Claudette?
Yeah, we didn't, this policy was the fund balance reserve. It didn't, it's not the highway fund chart of accounts and fund balance reserve. It was the fund balance reserve policy.
Right, but we did discuss all of the others, so should we just pull it out so it's just fund balance, because that's what we are moving forward with?
Yep.
Okay,
That would be my,
all right, well, I will amend my motion. I move to accept as a first reading the fund balance reserve policy as presented tonight.
So a
Second.
second. Okay, made by Mary, seconded by Marcia. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. And so I imagine that Claudette and Marcia will clean this up a little bit and bring it back for future second reading. Okay, so let's move on to so I should have said at the start of our meeting that one board member had a hard stop at 7, right? So we're now we're a little over, right? So we'll go through our agenda as best as possible, given that, okay? Next is the debt management policy. Mary and Marcia?
Do you want to introduce it, Marcia?
Sure. So Mary and I spent an awful long time wrestling with this, and I sent a memo to all of you, which is the sort of shared concerns and issues that we had and things that we wanted to highlight about it. So hopefully you've been through that. What we're really concerned about are those 4 issues. The statutory limit for municipal debt, which we are a bit confused about based on the wording that the auditor used. And Mary has sent a request for some clarification from her. We listened to the tape again, the CATV tape from December. And Bonnie's away until the 12th. And I was also going to write to the VLTC. I have a nice contact there, I think, who can help now, and see what he has to say about it. But we're also concerned about the level of indebtedness of the town and the current level of it, the probability of future environmental or other disasters, and then the homestead increase tax, all going towards trying to keep the load on the taxpayers as low as possible. So essentially, we went through the policy, and on page 6 of it, we've got an analysis basically of the current level of tax debt per capita and the current existing debt, the unknown of the Vermont homestead, and the debt limits, and that those kinds of projections that the auditor made, you know, a $4 million debt. I put in a chart which hopefully helps to explain that if we go up in debt amounts, the percentage that we'll have against the grand list. But the question is whether or not the debt should be calculated against the grand list or against assets. So we have some things that we need to resolve, and we wanted the board to see this and to make some decisions and give us some guidance. What did I miss, Mary?
No, I think that's good. And writing to the auditor, we asked her to put in writing an explanation of the remarks that she made in the December 2nd, 2020 meeting, because we just need clarification on it. We do know the statutory limit for municipal debt in general, which is quite horrifying. It's 10 times the amount of the grand list. And so that's very clear. But as far as our own debt ratio and what might be a reasonable amount of debt for the town and what it's based on, we have to continue to do some research and kind of nail that down a little better. And the other thing was we touched upon, of course, was the short-term debt, as I mentioned before. Was just thinking back to the 2017 situation where we did have to repair the road damage. And I think there was a time limit, I think 72 hours or something like that. We had to do that, but then we had to pay the people who, the contractors that you get to do that work. And then we, of course, had to, there was a lot to do with specifications of a more permanent rebuild, but all of that had to be paid for upfront before we could, and documented before we could get the FEMA money. So that's where our idea for another fund, a disaster fund, came from. But maybe, as Herb has expressed, that we should just think of those as act of God situations and just make sure that we can get a very healthy line of credit. I think we had it's like $1.2 million or 1.4 from Mascoma Bank. That's a decision point, I think, that the board might want to think about, and with some input from the town manager and different people or other towns, how they handle it, how Thetford handled it, and so forth. So We also went through and tried to just refer to statute whenever possible. A lot of the, there is a lot in statute about how to deal with debt. And I think our old policy kind of reflected that, but we went back through and carefully read the VLCT debt management documents and dug out the statutes and tried to reference them as part of the logic train for this, for this draft. So.
Okay.
In fact, it pretty clearly tracks that model.
Yes. So do any board members have comments for this, these substantial amendments? Go ahead, Claudette.
Yeah, one of my big questions is again, the disaster relief fund. I personally don't think we need a separate disaster relief fund. We can revisit if interest rates start to creep up to a point where we may get concerned that paying the interest even on a short-term line of credit would be too much of an increase in debt. But at this point in time, I don't think we need a disaster relief fund. Plus, hopefully we'll be getting infrastructure money from the feds. Let's hope. And I think our resilience has really improved since 2017, where other towns have seen washouts and culvert damage with the storms just this past week. We haven't. And the other piece that I'm reading over the policy is the question about enterprise funds.
Mhm.
I don't think we have, from my understanding of an enterprise fund, it's a fund that the fees that you collect essentially offset the cost of whatever it is you're trying to run. And I don't think we have, is that?
Well,
Probably
The fire district would be a good example of an enterprise fund. So the users pay for this provision of the service, whether that's a base fee or a user fee or a combination thereof.
Right. And I just don't see us as having any, well, there are potentially two possibilities, but they've never been self-supporting, and that's the transfer station and possibly the rec department. So I don't see us as having, I can see us as potentially going down the rabbit hole if we try to establish some enterprise funds. And I guess I get a little apprehensive when we look to establish or to write a policy that addresses some unique situations instead of just a broad overarching policy. And I'm saying this about the homestead piece, and because we have yes, there is, I guess, and I understand we want to have debt controlled, but we can't control the school part of things. And if we want to watch the collective debt of the school and the town, then we really need to sit down with the school.
Right. That was my take too, Claudette. The debt ratio section, I think needs the most work, and I think it's wonderful background information to inform a policy, right? But I think it's not that legislation isn't even adopted, right? So the equalization. So I would actually just strip the policy of all of that.
Is there a way to define that more generally?
Delete this, delete the
Well,
section.
okay, strip it out. Strip out what is there
delete
But-
everything that refers to S13.
Yeah. So strip all that out. But I think you and Claudette have a very good point about not bringing up the specifics, although if we're doing strategic planning or something like that, we definitely want to keep this in mind. But when a possible tax increase of this nature is possible, I think we do need to have some way of planning for it.
What is?
Well, first, I would say that if you listen to Tim and Jim when they presented before the school board, this was not, the projection was not going to be that this was going to be a 1 year in your face, if it passes as proposed, increase, that it would be a phased in gradual increase. That was the best that that was their take at least. And I say, keep it in the back of your mind.
It's too
There are
much
so
to have
many
in the
things.
policy, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
you could argue that who knows what's going to happen in 2020.
I mean, should we also base our budgeting around the fact that we have a universal healthcare law? Like, no, we still like budget for the salaries as if we don't have that law, right? So like, let's get rid of S13.
Okay,
from
so
this
it's too
policy.
specific. Okay, that's fine.
Go ahead, Marcia. Sorry.
So I do
Sorry, Claudette, too.
I think in general, Claudette's got a good point. You know, we're always talking about affordability of housing in this town, and this is part of it. And I think that, you know, at some point it would be good to sit down with the school and say, here's the big picture, right? And we are committed to affordability in this town, which includes your taxes. So we should keep that in mind. But, you know, we can strip that out of here. In terms of the enterprise, again, I certainly wasn't familiar with that. And looking around, I saw that Ludlow had one, and they were using it for a public building. And if you think about fees, I mean, obvious ones are septic and all that kind of stuff that people use, or water. But you could define fees as any of, you know, we pay taxes and they're paid at Tracy Hall. I mean, I don't know how broad you can make that argument for an enterprise fund, but it would be interesting to talk to some towns like Ludlow, people who have used it, to see if it has any merit. And for now, I just threw it in because it's in the model policy. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcia. Yeah. Good.
I
Claudette,
think-
did you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I saw Claudette's hand.
You could go next door to Hartford, and their transfer station is an enterprise fund. And it is so woefully, it's millions of dollars in the hole. So the fees that they collect do not support in any way, shape, or form that transfer station. I don't know how their sewer enterprise fund is doing. I'm guessing that is probably more in balance, and you look at Lebanon, and they've had to massively increase their sewer and water rates to cover the cost of that service. So
I'm just
Okay.
wondering what the benefit of an enterprise fund is, because I don't know.
Well-
Go ahead, Mary. And then-
Oh, just in the case of Ludlow, it might be some kind of fee structure that has to do with the ski area. Because in the example where, you know, the select board was using funds for buildings and various needs of the town, they also said, well, skiing wasn't so good this year, so the enterprise fund is not so flush. So, I mean, to use it to run an entity where the fees are not going to cover what you're trying to do, of course, would be foolish. And, you know, we could take this out too, but I think maybe, I find it interesting. Maybe Marcia and I could just research it and see if there's any benefit to the town, like just pull it out for now and just sort of do a little more research about whether or not it would be a good idea. You know, I think, remember when we were wanting to have the sort of a centralized version of all the fees in town, like just to know what they were and how close they were to the type of activity that was being paid for. I don't know if you had one for Tracy Hall, would that kind of focus that, bring it out? So you'd say, well, how's that Tracy Hall Enterprise Fund doing, and look at it. Or it might just be another level of bureaucracy. So.
Or the green fund, the green lending fund.
The
we
Green
would-
Lending Fund, yeah. Which is not really our authority to do anything about it, but you know, what is that? And how does that ever become discussed?
If I can speak,
Go ahead, Rob. Yeah.
my understanding of the enterprise fund would be that it's applied to new projects as they are envisioned. So without prejudice, if it was decided that there was enough pressure to require a sewer system that hooks up to Hartford, then the development, the projects that created that pressure would be taxed for their share of what money was needed to proceed. Does anybody disagree with that?
I think for a water or sewer, I think there generally are fees, but I don't imagine they cover the entire cost.
So I want to take us a step back a little bit, because I don't think we've actually discussed the actual most important part of this policy, which is the level of debt that we would like to establish in policy.
Okay.
And there is that, and I think Marcia sort of pointed out two possible ways of thinking about it. One was in terms of assets, I believe, and then also in terms of the grand list, right? And there was that chart. So I think what I would like to do in the little bit of time that we have time left for this policy is to talk about that a little bit, and then I want to sort of get back to like how we clean. I think there was a consensus on sort of some of that one section that we were talking about, the one with S13, sort of cleaning up the debt ratios section a little bit as per our discussion, and then so I think that is in good order for a second reading. And I'm just summarizing what I'm hearing, so correct me, please. But now I would like to actually talk about the debt load that we would like to take on. So go ahead, Claudette.
I agree with, I can't remember if it was Marcia's comment or Mary's comment in the draft policy that 10 times the grand list is some level of debt that I personally am not willing to even consider entertaining. So the
What would you entertain, Claudette?
what would I entertain?
Yes.
I would be very interested in hearing Bonnie's response to Mary's letter. If it is the 3 to 4 million, and how that's calculated.
Yeah,
I
I
would
think
like to know that.
I think that's really wise to hear that. And it sounds as though private businesses are evaluated a different way, like it's on their assets. But in the statute says, well, a percentage of the property in town, not just the municipal assets, but the entire property of the town. So I'd like to hear more about that too, because it's very confusing.
Okay. Herb has a point that he'd like to make. Go ahead, Herb.
So just one, I'm not trying to throw a monkey in the wrench, but just trying to throw a sort of anecdotal perspective at it is that you've got to think about debt, not just for, say, the things that you do to build a sewer line or a roadway or what have you, but also like we did with the July 1 storm, we went out and got effectively short-term debt to handle that situation. In other words, a level of credit that went up to I can't remember, it was $3.5 or $4 million. And that, you know, for that short period of time, you got a blip that's taking it up, but it is in anticipation that you're going to get reimbursed, in this case from FEMA. So there are periods where you are going to be willing to have an excessive amount of debt on the books, like the July 1 storm for a short-term period, but not the long term. So I just want to make sure that that's understood when you're establishing a debt limit. Maybe you establish a regular debt limit maximum, but then for those once in a while, again, act of God, July 1 storm type things, that you have a willingness to go up to a certain amount over that, but only for, say, 3 or 5 years maximum. Is that making sense?
It makes sense to me. Yeah, people are nodding.
Is there a way to not standardize, but set limits on the ratio of long-term plan debt and short-term requirements? And how much should that short-term borrowing with expectation of remuneration be counted into the concept of what the level of debt for the town is?
Well, sorry,
You go ahead.
the statute seems to say that you're looking at all of the debt except the bonded debt. There's two parts to that statute. So that to me is a little bit dangerous. I mean, on the one hand, it's nice, right? But on the other hand, it's saying you don't have to count that, so you could actually have more debt than you're thinking about.
Right, Herb is nodding. Yeah, and do you want to say a little bit more about that, Marcia? Why? I guess it's obvious why it's dangerous, or
yeah. I mean, if you're calculating and saying we only want this much debt according to the statute, which is all of our debts except bonded debt, up to a limit of 10 times the grand list, that's a huge amount of debt, which we just don't want. And so if you forget about the bonded debt that's on top of it, then I think you're really in trouble. So I think at some point, maybe this has to say all of the debt, including the bonded debt, we don't want to be more than X.
yeah, that makes sense to me. Does it make that make sense to other board members?
Yeah, it does. Coming up with a number, it's going to be interesting. I think that's why we need to talk to the auditor, I don't know, look at other towns or something.
Instead of a hard number, could it be a percentage of something?
Sure. But even that, yeah, I think that's a sensible way to go, but that will result in a number.
Yeah.
And that's that paragraph 5.3.3 we've got shall not exceed X.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't decide.
But leaving it as a percentage allows for it to increase gradually as your
Oh, yes,
as
that's
whatever
true.
increases.
No, it definitely should be a percentage.
And could you throw in some little sentence that does say, that provides the caveat that if there is a catastrophic event, that we're willing to, that there should be consideration of an increase in that limit to cover upfront costs. And I can't remember if that was buried in that policy someplace.
It seems like it's more about the defining the
Short
use of
term,
short-term debt.
Right.
Yeah.
In this policy, as Claudette is now alluding to, and as Herb has previously spoken to. So yes, the short-term debt allowances temporarily. Otherwise, the 3 to 4% sounds like what we've had in our original policy. Because remember, this was an exercise in affirming our financial policies, and now we're doing more.
No, it's very good what we're doing.
Yes, I'm just reminding us of the origin. Yes, so we've kept the number of the original policy in the end so far.
We've kept it because we don't know what to change it to. That's
Yeah.
kind of why we want to call it X. Because I don't think the 1%, I don't think that's going to work. But we don't have a good suggestion that's backed up with the prudent.
So it
Logic.
sounds, so to wrap up this discussion, if I may, because I want to get a little bit to the gift
Mhm.
policy before we have to leave
Yep.
for tonight. It sounds like we're going to, Mary and Marcia are going to look at the 3 to 4% number, right? And then think more about defining short-term debt and what that means. You're going to sort of majorly alter the section on, gosh, where is it?
That's 13. We're
Debt,
skipping that.
debt
part.
ratios, the debt ratio section. And then I think that was it. I mean, I think the other issue that we haven't gotten consensus on was the emergency fund. And for what it's worth, I agree with Claudette. I think that should be stripped
Too
from this
much.
policy.
Okay.
But we don't have consensus on that. So that's just me and Claudette right now.
Clarification. So under the debt ratios, the first 3 paragraphs are basically just facts.
Yeah.
So those, I found that sobering to just look at the facts, and I think there's some value to having them in there. And I'm understanding that this policy gets reviewed every year. Is that true?
We
Should be.
did it this year, so yes. Yes, I'll say yes.
So do you want the facts in or out?
I mean, I don't feel strongly either way.
What section are you referencing, Marcia?
5.3.
5.3 is
5
ratios, and 5.3, 1, 1, and 1, 2 are really just the facts,
informational.
informational.
It
Could be in a memo rather than in the policy.
or in an appendix.
Oh, appendix.
Okay.
Wow.
I don't think
Okay.
to give you a straight answer from my POV, Marcia, I don't think we need it actually. But I do, but I say that now having the knowledge of Reddit, right? So now I have Reddit, I have gained that knowledge, it informs my reading of the policy. And so to say that like if future board members like have that as part of a policy, would that, be effective? I don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Can we agree on a footnote?
So
That works.
from a formatting perspective, this is like terrible, but yes, that's fine, right?
Well, it's a footnote or
It's
like background
Yeah,
information.
background, yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Did that clarify your question?
Yeah,
I think
that's very good.
Are you comfortable, Mary, with where we're
Yes.
going?
Yep.
Okay.
And Claudette, go ahead.
So I move to accept the first reading of the proposed debt management policy as amended tonight.
A second.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you.
Who was the second on that? Sorry.
Mary?
I
was the
was.
second? Yes, Mary.
Thank
was the
you.
second. Okay, so we have a hard stop at 7, and so we've gotten to kind of our midpoint of our agenda. But I do want to talk about the gift policy because I think that was the major policy that we really wanted to take a look at in this process. So I'll just go really quickly. Claudette and I worked on this together. What we really wanted to set out to do with this policy was exactly what the purpose says, which was to define a uniform criteria, procedures, and guidelines for the acceptance of gifts in a responsible and transparent and accountable manner, right? That's the purpose statement. And then the policy statement is that we want to make sure that we have consistent criteria and procedures, and we have adequate resources for their administration and an appropriate acknowledgement. So I think this was a rewrite of the policy, right? And so I think the most significant thing was we took out the definitions consistent with budgeted items and inconsistent with budgeted items, to create definitions that instead define who has the ability to solicit donations and to what amounts, and then a little bit of a process as to what kinds of questions should be asked when accepting a donation. So, and that is what we sort of set out to do. The one thing that I had added sort of after a lot of the discussions that Claudette and I had is that the town has a policy and procedure for the Norwich Conservation Fund that was established on May 20th, 96. And so any request to help acquire a property or property interests for relating to conservation of land and waters are addressed in that policy. And I'm happy to send that to board members. Go ahead, Claudette. Did anything?
And
I
then
missed?
two of the things that or actually that I think that are significant additions, at least I believe they're additions, is that committees and commissions appointed by the select board cannot solicit for funds. So, and that there be absolutely no appearance of a quid pro quo. So, and part of that, yeah, so those.
That is significant. Yeah. So no committees. And then there's some dollar amounts in terms of what we expect at department heads. Mary and then Herb, I get, or Mary and then Marcia. Go ahead, Mary.
So in the past, when we talked about gifts, we were, are we including grants under this? Like, we had concern about the grant that was sought by the police department, which we later gave back. Is that considered a gift too, or is that a separate?
So the donation or gift definition is any monetary cash contributions, endowment, bequest, personal property, real property, in-kind goods or services, or any other asset. So
I would say yes under that. Would you say yes?
I mean, I would say that was the intention, but the word grant does not appear in that definition. So
I just wonder whether we did have a concern about a private individual giving to a department that has to do with public safety. We were quite concerned about that, but I didn't feel as though the safeguards in this policy spelled that out. Or it's just a question in my mind. Is that too specific? Am I being a little, I don't know, just like to hear what others think?
go ahead, Marcia.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mary. I actually wrote a 2-page memo on this. I have some real concerns that basically I was pleased to see that there shouldn't be any solicitations, but I think it should be expanded so that, a little legalistically, so that anybody representing the town shouldn't be soliciting, because once we've got something, then we have trouble. I would like to see I would recommend that the select board review all of the gifts, and I'm concerned mostly because if we are given something like where a gift of real property is offered, I'm concerned about lots of ways that could blow up in our faces. And I think we need to be careful, if there was a partition required so that somebody was giving part of their property, and in return for that, it begins to look like a quid pro quo if they're getting a lower tax rate because of it. I'm also concerned about the ramifications of legal expenses to cure problems that we don't know about if somebody is given property to the town. For example, I think you mentioned it in the policy, but there can be clouds on title. There can be, covenants running with the land, like Act 250 permits, all sorts of things that would actually be restrictions on the use of land. I'm concerned about holding that property for any period of time, what that's, oh, and then hazardous waste issues, I think somebody mentioned that. But holding it and the loss of tax revenue that the town might suffer, I'm very concerned about current or future profits that could result as a result of that gift. So imagine somebody gives land to the town. The Affordable Housing Committee asked for land to be given just recently. Well, if somebody gives land and that land has problems and we have to fix it, that's one expense. But on the other hand, what happens downstream if that land then goes to a developer and a lot of money is made on that property? I don't think we're doing a service to the people who have donated that to the town if profits are realized by other people.
So,
Maybe that's okay, but it should be spelled out. So I've made a lot of corrections. And so I'd like to just send that to you and let everybody
yes.
think.
So I would say, like, correct me if I'm wrong, Marcia, but the mechanism for some of your suggestions might come under the section types of donations under 2. When making such approval, the select board shall consider, says the appraised value of the donation, any expenditures or maintenance obligations for the town, potential liabilities associated with the donation, such as, right? So I think there is a mechanism in the policy as drafted for those concerns. They just need to be added to. Does that
Punch
is
it
that
up.
true,
That's
or-
right.
Okay.
That's true. And I also think that certain things should be put back on the donor. So the town doesn't have the expense. For example, valuations and things, those should be looked at through the listers and things. But I think the donors should have to provide evidence of clear title and maybe environmental things. Again, I'm just talking about
Property.
if it's real property. But and then I wondered why have a distinction between the levels of cash donations or other kinds of donations. It seems to me anything that's given could have some sort of a ramification, and to simplify the procedure, just have the select board look at it, and then you can figure out, whether there's a conflict, if it's going to mess up a budget, if it's going to, incur expenses that we just don't want for a particular department or for the town in general, and the optics of the particular thing.
I think Claudette didn't necessarily, Claudette advocated more on that side, I would say, right, in our work together, Claudette, and I sort of was the push back in the sense that department heads should have the abilities to, run their departments, and to some extent, minor solicitations of gifts as a part of that. And I'm not speaking sort of eloquently. That sounds very dubious the way that I described it, but and perhaps Herb can sort of talk about a little bit more about how they interact with potential donors in our town, and if it's a low donor, if it's a low amount. But I agree that like the amount doesn't necessarily make it any less liable. Go ahead, Mary.
I apologize, but I have to leave. So,
Okay, yes.
sorry.
Yeah, and it's okay. And I think let's just wrap up our discussion a little bit more of this, and then I will, and then perhaps we should look to adjourn. Go ahead, Claudette.
Actually, I think Rob was first.
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so the provisions all looked like they did look at most of the angles that could be involved, but it's implicit that the select board has to do due diligence to find out what the ramifications are of a gift, such as real properties and so on. I mean, it's there in the policy that's required. It should be emphasized.
And my point was going to just be that if Marcia could send to Roger and I actually, if Marcia, if you could send them to Roger, since he was the first writer, and then Roger can look at them and then send along any other revisions.
Right, and I think, and look, like I think we might want to also hear a little bit Herb, do you have anything to sort of add on this a little bit? Because I think the beneficiary department head makes a process, proposes a process for our department heads, in fact. And so is there anything that you would speak to for
Just
that?
in general, I don't think it should have beneficiary department head in there. It should just be wherever that is, put town manager in there for basically from that standpoint.
Okay.
I think basically it's the town that's receiving the funds, not any particular individual. And there are certain individuals that are bonded to receive those things. So that's why I just sort of say the town. I think that when you get into, when you're talking about the value, I still think that it's that the town manager's accepting the things or the staff that's here, but for those things that are over $5,000, that would have to be, with the acceptance has to be with approval of the select board. So in other words, the board is not technically receiving the funds. The town's receiving the funds through my office and my like the finance office. But you would want to have a form of approval to say, before we accept that, you're going to sign off on it. So there's just some little semantic language there, but I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying.
So, okay. So
I'll mark up stuff.
Yeah. And I guess my question is, do we see in practice that would happen?
Well, I think this goes back to the larger issue of what do you want to accept funds for? So whether that's, and I say funds in the broad category of everything, whether that's land or what have you, that I do think that the town, whether partly through sanctioned documents like the town plan, like say a capital budget and program, the budget and anything that may be in there project specific, that if there are sanctioned or approved documents that have a list of things in them, or there's even a separate list that the board, periodically updates that say these are the things that we, if we receive donations, that we would look to have go toward those things. So that if something comes in of more of a certain value, it should have already been weighed against that list or that sanctioned document or whatever it is, so to try to minimize this. I don't want to create a whole bureaucracy of so to speak, of accepting things. I'd hope that we could try to use these other tools that give direction to people. And then but you're always, I think in Norwich, going to get something that somebody wants to do something, no one's talked about it at all, and they would like to contribute toward it, a legacy project of some sort. Again, where there's a level of value to that, obviously I think the key there is wherever you set that value for where you think it's large enough where it has to go through you, it's just going to automatically have to be presented, if you will, at the board level, whether that's an executive session to begin with, because sometimes it's dealing with real estate transactions or things like that, or just in the regular open meeting. There may be other things that are out there that pertain to specific projects or what have you that are less than that.
I don't know what happened, but we can't hear either Roger.
That was crazy.
There might be a battery in the wireless mic going bad or something. It scared me.
Yeah, it was.
No?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. No, nothing? Can't hear me?
Try it again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, you can hear me. God.
There we go.
I'm like, can you hear me now?
And we got CBS and NBC.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I'm surrounded by microphones. So Herb, so what you might be saying is, that there's some kind of process where this beneficiary department head, rather than sort of defining a process for their work, their solicitation work, right, which we define sort of value amounts, you're suggesting that there might be some kind of list that results in a procedure or process, and that then the policy speaks to that list of gifts, or what have you.
Right. So basically what I'm saying is just that all the department heads work underneath me. So where you have that, it should just be me, and I would be working internally with that, whatever that process is, with a particular department head for those things that may be of lesser amounts, or if somebody approaches a department head with a larger type thing, obviously I have to talk with them anyway, and that would then get to the board level as well. Is that?
Yeah. Marcia, did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I'm just concerned about, the focus on the value of something. First of all, who decides what the value is? And second of all, I always think about the bizarre sort of law school examples. What if somebody has 40 Angora goats and they say to the transfer station, we want you to take these Angora goats and have them eat all of the composting material, and that will save money. And so they say that's a great idea, and Herb says they're not worth $5,000, so we'll take them. And then people are allergic to Angora goats, and you can see it on.
Oh my God. That's actually a very real example, because right, Claudette, we're gonna get them to eat all of that compost. No, okay.
Right. I think it shouldn't be about monetary stuff, and I think that there should be a consistent policy so that it gets to us at some point and we're saying, yeah, we agree with that, or we don't agree with that.
Okay, Rob.
We have to take up in a meeting a $10 contribution of some sort, or $10 in value. And how often does this happen that I quit my full-time job and decide I'll just sit in meetings here?
What? Sorry, I missed that. Well,
It was just a complaint.
Yeah.
But I think a valid question is, does it rise to needing our attention for a minor, something of minor value?
And I think that was the spirit, right? And also a gesture towards, I think, the perception that we might be looking to control the generosity of our residents as a governing body, and that there should maybe be a spirit of less of that, right? So I think it was gesturing towards that, Rob. So yes.
And also becoming aware of multiple of either people soliciting donations for projects that we did not have any knowledge of.
That's right.
So that is that's kind of where I was coming from, that we shouldn't be somehow blindsided by, hey, we want, by reading a listserv post that says, send your money to.
Or I'm allergic to the Angora goats. I think I'm just a proponent of communication so that everybody is aware, so that, like Claudette said, we're not blindsided.
Yeah, and true or false, does this policy address that?
Roger, now we can't hear you.
True, can you hear me now?
You're muted.
Can you
You're
hear me now?
muted. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So true or false, does this policy address that issue? Like, we now have a process that we learn of these gifts in this policy. Would you say that's true? Or could be made more clear?
More clear. It reads to me like some people can make decisions and then we find out about it.
Okay, so, all right, this is enough feedback, I think. Okay, good, yeah. Herb said that's good, so we feel good. Okay, so it's 7:12. Mary left us at 7 in our agenda setting process. Oh, go ahead, Claudette.
So are we unwilling to accept this policy as a first read as amended?
Yes, thank you for that. So is there a second for that motion?
Or, so let me rephrase.
Rephrase.
I move that we accept as a first read the gift policy as amended.
We didn't, as presented. Okay. Okay. So friendly amendment is, it could be as presented rather than as amended because we are amending it.
As presented, yes.
Okay, okay. Now, is there a second to that friendly amendment? Okay, great. Claudette and then Marcia. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor? Sorry.
So I understood that you were going to look at the proposed and punch it up a little bit.
Yep. That's right, because it's the first reading. All in favor now? Please raise your hand. Okay, great. All right, so now, thank you, Claudette. Now what I was sort of saying was that we are halfway through this work. I think in our agenda setting process, we talked about the importance of having us all 4 policies. Mary did have to leave at 7. So I am wondering if we should table these to a future special meeting, the remaining of our agenda. How do we feel about that? With acknowledgement that this was productive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's like the capital budget one is pretty important.
Yep,
We should have everybody here.
yep. Yep.
As much as I hate putting it off, I think the capital budget.
Well, and we can do it at a, oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying we could do it as part of our entryway into the capital budgeting discussions, which we've really wanted to affirm by August, right? And so it's now July, so we should begin with the discussion of the policy. And so maybe we can do that at our next meeting and have some of these other policies maybe be a future special meeting. Okay. So yeah. Speaking of which, yes. So Herb is referencing the tax rate meeting that is coming up. Okay, so that being said, I'm gonna say that the board agreed by consensus to table the rest of their items to a future meeting. Is that right? Okay. Great. And then with that, we can make a motion to adjourn. Can I?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
Is it seconded by Marcia? All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. Thank you so much. That was good work, even though we didn't get through it all.
Happy 4th of July.
That's right.
Don't forget the next meeting is Tuesday.
The next meeting is Tuesday. Herb tells us because we have to set our tax rate. So Tuesday at 6:30, not 5:30.
Do we always use the exact same Zoom link?
No.
It wasn't on my agenda.
You probably downloaded Roger's initial agenda and not the formal agenda that was presented to the listserv.
Yes.
The one that came out or whatever, that was sent to us from Pam.
And my apologies, I said I would forward the official sort of final agenda from the town's account, but Pam forwarded it to us, I think, actually. Pam Mullen did. So, and apologies.
Pam said it was at 6:30 and there was no Zoom thing on it.
There's definitely a Zoom link on it, and I know in the body of her email at least it said 5:30, but we'll take note, and I will say that our special meeting on Tuesday is at 6:30.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, I was late.
Okay, well, we've adjourned, so maybe we're now just chatting as 4 people, right?
Have a good week, Rob.
Have a good
Oh,
weekend,
thank you.
everyone.
If I have cell phone coverage or some Wi-Fi, I will join, but
Okay, yes, we understand, Rob.
Enjoy.
thank you.
Take care.
Bye.